The stars looked peaceful from the bridge of the USS Blackstar, and Commander Jake Morrison stood with his hands behind his back as he watched the distant lights of New Haven Colony through the viewport, and the colony was home to 2 million people who lived their lives farming and mining and building homes on a world that humanity had claimed just 30 years ago, and Morrison had been stationed here for 8 months. And in all that time, the most exciting thing he had seen was a small, pirate vessel that surrendered the moment they powered up their weapons, and life on the frontier was supposed to be quiet, and that was exactly how Morrison liked it, because quiet meant people were safe, and that was what mattered most to him and his crew of 847 men and women. Lieutenant Amy Walker sat at her tactical station running the daily system scan, and she was 29 years old with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and she had served under Morrison for 3 years and trusted him completely, and beside her sat Danny Cruz at the weapons console, and he was a young officer with quick reflexes and a talent for making impossible shots, and he spent his free time practicing targeting simulations until he could hit a target the size of a baseball from 10,000 kilometers away. And at the engineering station, Paul Henderson monitored the ship's experimental systems, and he was older than most of the crew, with gray in his hair and hands that knew every circuit and pipe in the ship. And he had built half of the Blackstar systems himself and treated the ship like it was his own child. The Blackstar was not like other ships in the United Earth Space Navy, and it was a testbed for new technologies that other ships did not have, and deep in its hull sat a reactor that could produce 3 times the power of a normal ship, and it had weapons that existed in multiple dimensions at once, and a jump drive that could move the ship short distances instantly during combat. And most of these systems had never been used in real battle because they were too new and too dangerous. And Morrison sometimes wondered if they would ever need them, because humanity had been at peace with most of the galaxy for over a decade, and the few hostile species out there knew better than to attack human colonies. Lisa Grant sat at the communication station monitoring the standard channels, and she was listening to civilian traffic from New Haven when something made her pause, and there was a signal coming from the edge of the system, and it was not human, and it was not any of the known friendly species, and she ran it through the computer 3 times before she trusted what she was seeing. And then she turned to Morrison with a worried expression and told him they had unknown contacts entering the system, and Morrison walked over to her station and asked how many. And she checked her screens again, and her hands started shaking as she counted, and she said 63 ships, and they were big, and they were not responding to hails. Morrison felt his stomach drop, but his voice stayed calm as he ordered battle stations, and alarms rang through the ship, and crew members ran to their posts, and within 2 minutes everyone was ready, and Amy Walker brought up the tactical display and showed him what they were facing, and the unknown ships were massive, and some of them were 3 times the size of the Blackstar, and they were moving in formation toward New Haven, and their weapons were powered up and their shields were active, and Morrison had never seen anything like them, and neither had anyone else on the bridge, because these were not pirates and these were not raiders, and this was an invasion fleet. The communications came through, and Lisa Grant put it on the main speakers, and a voice spoke in perfect English, and it said that the Velcron Dominion had claimed this sector of space, and all human colonies would surrender immediately or be destroyed, and there would be no negotiation and no mercy, and humanity had 1 hour to comply. And then the transmission ended, and Morrison stood very still for a moment, thinking about the 2 million people on New Haven who were about to die if someone did not stop this fleet. And he opened a channel to Admiral Frank Bishop, who commanded the defense fleet for this sector, and the Admiral's face appeared on screen, and he looked older than his 50 years, and very tired. Bishop told Morrison that he was gathering what ships he could, and there were 3 battlecruisers in the area, and a dozen smaller vessels, and they would engage the Velcron fleet at the edge of New Haven's orbit, and he said it with no confidence in his voice, because everyone knew that 13 ships could not stop 63. And Morrison asked what his orders were, and Bishop looked at him for a long moment before saying that the Blackstar should evacuate and run back to the core systems, and warn Earth Command about this new threat, and Morrison felt anger rise in his chest, but he kept it off his face, and he said, "Yes, sir," and ended the transmission. The crew was looking at him, and they all knew what evacuation meant, and it meant running away while 2 million people died, and it meant abandoning New Haven to an enemy that would show no mercy. and Morrison walked to the center of the bridge, and he looked at each member of his crew one by one, and he said he was going to give them a choice. And the choice was this, and they could follow orders and evacuate and live to fight another day, or they could stay and fight against impossible odds and try to save New Haven, even though it would probably mean their deaths. And he said he would not order anyone to stay, and anyone who wanted to leave could take the escape pods, and no one would think less of them. Nobody moved, and Amy Walker spoke first, and she said she was staying, and then Danny Cruz said the same, and then Paul Henderson, and then Lisa Grant, and one by one every person on the bridge said they would stay, and Morrison felt something break inside his chest, but it was a good kind of breaking, and he nodded and told them to prepare for combat. And Paul Henderson asked if he could unlock the experimental systems, and Morrison said yes, and told him to unlock everything, because if they were going to do this, then they were going to do it right. And the engineer smiled, and his fingers flew over his console as he disabled safety protocols and brought forbidden weapons online. The Velcran fleet reached Admiral Bishop's defensive line, and the battle began, and Morrison watched on the long-range sensors as the human ships fought with everything they had. And it lasted 18 minutes, and when it was over, 3 battlecruisers were destroyed, and the smaller ships were scattered and running, and the Velcran fleet had not even slowed down. And now there was nothing between them and New Haven except one experimental ship with a crew that had chosen to die fighting. And Morrison took a deep breath and gave his first order, and he told Amy Walker to plot an attack course, and she smiled as her hands worked, and the USS Blackstar turned toward the enemy and began to accelerate. The Blackstar moved through the asteroid field like a hunting shark, and Morrison stood at the center of the bridge watching the tactical display as the Velcran fleet advanced toward New Haven, and they were moving slowly now, because they thought they had already won, and they thought no human ship would dare challenge them after what they did to Admiral Bishop's fleet, and that overconfidence was going to be their first mistake, and Morrison intended to make them pay for every mistake they made because his crew had nothing to lose now, and that made them the most dangerous ship in the system. Paul Henderson had unlocked every experimental system on the ship, and some of them were glowing red on his display, because they were never meant to run at full power, and the reactor was producing energy levels that made the safety computer scream. Warnings every few seconds, and he had silenced those warnings because he did not need a computer telling him what he already knew, and the ship could tear itself apart if they pushed too hard. But Henderson had built these systems, and he knew exactly how far he could push them before they failed, and he planned to use every bit of that margin, because 847 lives against 63 warships meant they needed every advantage they could create. Amy Walker calculated their first strike, and she studied the Velcran formation looking for weaknesses, and she found that their ships traveled in groups of 3 with the smallest destroyers on the outside, and the larger cruisers in the middle, and the massive dreadnought in the very center, and the formation was strong against frontal assault, but it had gaps, and those gaps were where the Blackstar would strike, and she plotted a jump point that would put them behind a group of 3 destroyers and give them maybe 30 seconds before the enemy could react, and 30 seconds was all Danny Cruz would need. The weapons officer checked his targeting systems 3 times, and the quantum torpedoes were ready, and these were not normal weapons, and they existed in multiple dimensions at once, and when they hit a target they did not just explode, and they tore holes in space itself. And the Blackstar only had 48 of them because they were too expensive and too dangerous to mass produce, and Cruz planned to make every single one count, and he had already calculated firing solutions for the first engagement, and his hands rested on the controls waiting for Morrison's command. Morrison gave the order, and the jump drive activated and space twisted around the Blackstar, and for one moment they existed nowhere, and then they were behind 3 Velcran destroyers, and Cruz did not wait for a second order, and his fingers moved. And 6 quantum torpedoes launched, and they covered the distance in heartbeats, and the first destroyer's shields flashed and held for exactly 2 seconds before the torpedoes punched through, and the ship came apart in a ball of white fire, and the second destroyer tried to turn, but 3 more torpedoes hit its engines, and it went dark and started tumbling, and the third destroyer managed to raise full shields, but the last torpedoes hit it from 2 different dimensions at once, and its shield generators overloaded and exploded, taking half the ship with them. Amy Walker was already plotting the next jump, and she did not wait to see the results because they needed to keep moving, and staying still meant dying. And the Blackstar jumped again, and this time they appeared above a Velcran cruiser, and the fusion lances fired, and these were beams of concentrated stellar fire, and they burned through the cruiser's hull like it was paper, and the ship broke in half and atmosphere vented into space along with bodies and debris. And then the Blackstar was gone again, jumping to a new position before the enemy could return fire. The Velcran fleet reacted with fury, and 12 of their ships broke formation and came hunting for the single human vessel that dared to attack them, and they moved fast for ships their size, and their weapons had range that exceeded anything humanity had ever built, and Morrison watched them coming, and he smiled because angry enemies made mistakes, and he needed them to make mistakes, and Amy Walker took them deeper into the asteroid field, where the big Velcran ships would have trouble maneuvering, and the chase began. For 6 hours, the Blackstar played a deadly game, and they would appear and strike and disappear, and the crew worked like they had trained for this their entire lives, and Danny Cruz hit targets through gaps in asteroids that seemed impossible, and Lisa Grant hacked into Velcran communications and fed false coordinates to their fleet, and she sent 3 of their ships crashing into asteroids because they trusted their sensors more than their eyes, and Paul Henderson kept the systems running. Even as they overheated and sparked and warning lights turned his console into a Christmas tree of red and yellow, and he worked through it all with steady hands and a calm voice. They destroyed 19 enemy ships in those 6 hours, and each kill was a small victory. But the Blackstar was taking damage, and the hull had breaches on 3 decks, and main power was down to 60%, and they had used 30 of their quantum torpedoes, and the crew was exhausted, and Morrison could see it in their faces, but nobody complained. And nobody asked to stop because every minute they kept fighting was another minute that New Haven stayed safe. And 2 million people were evacuating. Now, and they needed more time. The Velcran changed tactics, and instead of chasing the Blackstar, they spread out and created a net, and they were trying to box the human ship in and trap it, and Amy Walker saw it happening. But their options were running out, and the asteroid field only covered so much space, and eventually they would have nowhere left to run. And she told Morrison they had maybe 2 more jumps before they were caught, and he nodded and asked Paul Henderson if the special weapon was ready, and Henderson looked at his display and then at Morrison, and he said it was ready, but using it would leave them defenseless, and Morrison said he knew, and asked if it would work, and Henderson said it should work, but they had never tested it, and Morrison laughed because nothing about this day had been tested. The plan was insane, and Amy Walker said so when Morrison explained it, and the plan was to make the Velcran think they had won, and they would drop shields and drift and vent atmosphere like they were crippled, and the enemy would move in close to finish them off, and that was when they would trigger the reactor overload and turn their entire ship into a directed energy weapon, and the blast would cripple every ship within 10,000 kilometers, and then they would detonate the mines they had been quietly placing throughout the asteroid field over the past 6 hours, and Lisa Grant had been doing that while she hacked their communications, and nobody had mentioned it because talking about it might make it seem too crazy. Morrison asked for volunteers to stay and fight, and he told everyone else to get to the escape pods, and not a single person moved toward the pods, and Danny Cruz said something that made Morrison's eyes burn, and he said they had come this far, together, and they would finish it together, and the whole bridge crew nodded, and Morrison looked at them and felt pride that hurt, because these were his people, and they were about to do something that would either save New Haven or kill them all, and probably both. The Blackstar dropped its shields and cut main power and began venting atmosphere from the damaged sections, and they drifted into open space away from the asteroids, and the Velcran fleet saw them and came like sharks that smelled blood, and 60 ships moved into a sphere formation around the crippled human vessel, and they closed in slowly because they wanted the crew to feel fear, and they wanted them to know they were about to die. And Morrison stood on the dark bridge lit only by emergency lights, and he counted enemy ships on the display, and when the last one moved into position, he looked at Paul Henderson and nodded. The engineer's hands flew over his console, and deep in the ship's core, the reactor began to overload, and it built power like a star being born, and energy readings went beyond anything the ship was designed to handle, and the whole vessel started to shake, and crew members grabbed onto their stations and held on, and Paul Henderson watched his numbers climb, and when they hit critical, he looked at Morrison one last time, and Morrison said, "Do it." And Henderson triggered the release. The USS Blackstar exploded outward with light, and every direction at once became a wall of directed energy, and it hit the Velcran sphere formation like the hand of an angry god, and shields that had withstood human weapons failed and collapsed. and the massive dreadnought at the center of their fleet went dark as every system overloaded, and smaller ships spun out of control, and the formation broke apart in chaos. And in that perfect moment of confusion, Amy Walker triggered the asteroid. Mines and hundreds of rocks moving at tremendous speed tore through the Velcron fleet, and ships that had no shields died quickly, and others tried to dodge and crashed into each other, and the perfect formation became a graveyard in less than 5 minutes. Morrison tried to stand, but the bridge was dark and quiet, and emergency power was gone and life support was failing, and he could see his breath in the cold air, and through the viewport, he saw the burning remains of the Velcron fleet, and then he saw 3 destroyers that had survived because they were far enough out to avoid the worst of the blast, and they were turning toward the Blackstar, and he knew they were coming to finish what they started. The 3 Velcron destroyers moved toward the dead Blackstar like vultures approaching a corpse, and Morrison could see them through the viewport as dark shapes against the stars, and his breath made clouds in the freezing air, because life support was offline and the ship had no power and no shields and no weapons, and all around him his crew sat in the darkness and they knew what was coming. And Morrison opened the ship-wide communications using the emergency battery system, and his voice echoed through every corridor and every room, and he told all non-essential personnel to get to the escape pods immediately. And that was an order. 300 crew members refused to leave, and they stayed at their posts in the dark and the cold. And Morrison did not have the strength to argue with them, because part of him was glad they stayed, and he did not want to die alone. And Amy Walker was still at her station even though her console was dead, and Danny Cruz checked his weapon systems knowing they would not respond, and Lisa Grant tried to send a final message to Earth Command, and she managed to transmit their full combat log before her system died, and at least someone would know what happened here. And Paul Henderson sat in the engineering section, surrounded by his broken machines, and he stared at the dead reactor and refused to accept that it was over. The Velcron destroyers took their time approaching because they knew the Blackstar could not run, and they could see the damage and the venting atmosphere, and they knew the humans inside were freezing and dying, and they wanted to board the ship and kill everyone personally because the Velcron did not believe in quick deaths, and they believed that enemies should suffer, and the whole galaxy should see what happened to species that resisted the Dominion. And the 3 ships moved into boarding positions and extended their docking tunnels and prepared to send their warriors across. Sergeant Leo Martinez commanded the Marine detachment, and he had 89 men and women under his command, and they gathered in the corridors near the airlocks where the Velcron would enter, and they had rifles and grenades and knives, and they wore their combat armor even though it was so cold that the metal burned to touch. And Martinez told his Marines that this was their last stand and they would make it count, and every Velcron they killed was one less that could hurt humanity. And his Marines checked their weapons and took positions and waited for the doors to open. The first airlock breached and Velcron warriors poured through, and they were massive creatures standing over 7 feet tall with thick armor that covered their bodies, and they carried plasma weapons that could melt through steel, and they moved with confidence because they had conquered 17 species before humanity, and they expected the humans to run or beg or die quickly, and instead, they met sustained rifle fire from prepared positions, and the first 6 Velcron fell before they understood they were in a fight, and Martinez threw a grenade that killed 4 more, and his Marines advanced firing as they moved, and the corridor became a kill zone. The second airlock opened on Deck 7, and Velcron warriors met Dr. Karen Price and 20 medical staff, who had armed themselves with whatever they could find, and Price had never fired a rifle in combat before. But she had watched her patients die, and she was filled with rage that burned hotter than fear, and she shot the first Velcron through the face and kept firing until her magazine was empty. And beside her, a young medic named Chris Hayes used a plasma cutter meant for surgery, and he burned through Velcron armor like it was nothing, and the medical staff fought like demons and held Deck 7 for 37 minutes. The third airlock opened on Deck 4, and that was where Danny Cruz had positioned himself with 15 crew members, and they had dragged ammunition crates into the corridor and built a makeshift fortress, and Cruz had taken a rifle from the armory, and he aimed like he aimed his weapons console with perfect precision, and he dropped Velcron warriors with single shots, and beside him a young officer named Kelly Foster used a grenade launcher, and she put grenades through doorways and around corners, and the Velcron could not advance without walking through fire. Paul Henderson was not fighting, and he was in the engineering section in total darkness working by touch alone, and his hands moved over conduits and relays that he knew by heart, and he was trying to do something impossible, and he was trying to restart a reactor that had been deliberately overloaded and burned out, and every engineer in the fleet would say it could not be done. But Henderson was not every engineer, and he had built this reactor, and he knew its secrets, and he worked with freezing fingers that could barely grip his tools, and he worked while the ship shook from explosions above him. And he worked because giving up was not something he knew how to do. Morrison left the bridge and went to Deck 4 where the fighting was heaviest, and he took a rifle from a dead crew member and joined the defense, and Amy Walker came with him because she said commanders should not fight alone. And they took positions beside crews and fired into the mass of Velcron warriors that kept coming. And the aliens were learning now, and they were using their plasma weapons to melt through walls and attack from unexpected angles, and Martinez had to fall back from his position and regroup with Morrison's group, and they were being pushed toward the center of the ship, and there was nowhere left to retreat. Lisa Grant died on Deck 6 defending the communications array, and she stayed at her post sending emergency signals until a Velcron warrior broke through, and she fought with a wrench and kept transmitting until the end, and her last message reached a human patrol ship 3 systems away, and they would come, but they would be too late. And on Deck 7, Dr. Price went down protecting a wounded Marine, and Chris Hayes dragged her to safety, but she died in his arms, telling him to keep fighting. And all over the ship humans fell, and the Velcron kept coming, and it seemed like it would never end. The Velcron commander came aboard personally, and he was larger than the other warriors, and his armor was decorated with symbols of conquest, and he moved through the corridors looking at the human dead. And he was impressed because humans fought harder than most species. And they had killed 63 of his warriors when they should have died quickly, and he decided he would take Commander Morrison alive and make an example of him. And he moved toward the bridge where his sensors said the human commander was located, and he brought 20 of his best warriors with him. Morrison saw them coming on Amy Walker's portable scanner, and he had 14 people left with him, and they were low on ammunition and exhausted and wounded, and he told them they had done enough, and anyone who wanted to surrender could, and nobody moved. And crews said something about how they had come this far, and Morrison smiled because his crew never stopped surprising him, and they prepared for the final assault. And Morrison said a silent prayer for all the people who had died, and all the people on New Haven who would live because of this sacrifice. Then the lights came on and everyone froze because that was impossible, and power was supposed to be gone forever. And Morrison looked at Amy Walker, and she looked at her scanner, and her eyes went wide, and she said the reactor was online and weapons were charging. And Morrison felt something explode in his chest, and he grabbed the wall communications panel, and he called down to engineering and asked if anyone was there. And Paul Henderson's voice came back tired and rough, and he said the reactor was running at 40%, and that was all he could give them. And Morrison wanted to laugh and cry at the same time, and he told Henderson he was a miracle worker, and Henderson said no, he was just stubborn. Morrison's voice went through the whole ship, and he told everyone to brace for combat maneuvers, and he ran toward the bridge with Amy Walker right behind him, and they jumped over bodies and ducked through damaged corridors and reached the bridge, and threw themselves into their seats. And Morrison brought up the manual controls, because the main computer was still dead, and Amy Walker worked her tactical station with bloody hands, and Danny Cruz arrived 30 seconds later and slid into his weapons console, and his targeting systems came online, and he saw that they had power for maybe 6 shots, and he made them count. The Velcron destroyers were still docked to the Blackstar, and they were trying to pull away when Morrison fired the maneuvering thrusters, and the whole ship lurched sideways and crashed into one of the destroyers, and the fusion lances came online and fired at point-blank range, and the destroyer's hull opened like a flower, and everything inside became fire. And Morrison pulled away and turned the Blackstar toward the second destroyer, and it was raising shields, but Cruz launched 2 quantum torpedoes, and they punched through before the shields reached full power, and the destroyer came apart in a silent explosion. The third destroyer managed to get free, and it was accelerating away, and Morrison pushed the Blackstar to follow, even though the ship was shaking itself apart, and warning lights covered every console, and Amy Walker said their hull could not take much more. And Morrison said it did not need to last long, and they closed the distance, and the Velcron destroyer was faster, but the Blackstar had fury on its side, and Cruz waited until they were close enough, and he fired their last 4 quantum torpedoes and every remaining fusion lance and everything hit at once, and the destroyer disappeared in a ball of light. Morrison sat in the command chair, and the silence on the bridge was complete, except for the sound of breathing and the occasional spark from damaged systems. And he looked at each member of his crew, and they looked back at him with eyes that had seen too much death. And Amy Walker had a plasma burn across her left arm, and Danny Cruz was bleeding from a cut above his eye, and everyone was covered in dust and blood, and the smell of burned metal hung in the air like a ghost. And Morrison realized he was shaking and he could not make it stop. The communications console came back online with emergency power, and voices flooded through from New Haven, and they were asking if anyone was alive, and if the battle was over, and Lisa Grant was not there to answer them because she died at her post. And Morrison felt that loss like a knife in his chest, and he reached over and opened the channel himself, and he told them the Velcron fleet was destroyed and New Haven was safe, and his voice cracked on those last words, and the people on the other end started crying and cheering, and Morrison closed the channel because he could not listen to their joy when so many of his crew would never hear it. Paul Henderson climbed up from engineering, and he looked like he had aged 10 years, and his hands were burned and his uniform was torn, and he walked onto the bridge and sat down heavily in an empty chair, and he told Morrison that the reactor was stable at 40%, but they could not jump and they could not fight, and if another enemy showed up they were dead. And Morrison nodded and said no more enemies were coming, and Henderson closed his eyes and said, "Good," because he was tired. And Morrison looked at the engineer who had done the impossible and brought them back from death, and he did not have words for what that meant. The casualty reports came in, and they were worse than Morrison feared, and 447 crew members were dead, and that was more than half, and another 200 were wounded, and only 200 remained uninjured. And Morrison read every name on the list, and he knew most of them, and he had served with them and laughed with them, and now they were gone, and Sergeant Martinez had died on Deck 4 holding a corridor with his last 3 Marines, and Dr. Price had died saving wounded, and Lisa Grant had died at her post, and the list went on, and Morrison wanted to break something, but his hands just shook. The rescue ships arrived 3 hours later, and they came from the core systems after receiving Lisa Grant's final transmission, and they found the Blackstar drifting among the wreckage of 63 Velcron ships, and at first they did not believe what they were seeing, and one ship could not have done this, and it was impossible, and they hailed the Blackstar, and Morrison answered, and his face on their screens told them everything they needed to know, and the rescue ships came alongside, and began transferring medical supplies and personnel and evacuating the wounded. Admiral Bishop arrived on a heavy cruiser, and he came aboard the Blackstar personally, and Morrison met him in what was left of the corridor outside the bridge, and the Admiral looked at the damage and the bodies being carried past and the blood on the walls, and he stopped in front of Morrison and for a long moment said nothing, and then he saluted. And Morrison returned the salute, and Bishop asked him how, and Morrison said his crew refused to lose. And that was the only explanation he had, and Bishop nodded like that made sense, and maybe it did. The news spread through human space like wildfire, and the story of the Blackstar and its crew became legend before the bodies were even cold, and people heard about the single ship that faced impossible odds and won, and they heard about Commander Jake Morrison, who gave his crew a choice, and they chose to fight, and they heard about Paul Henderson, who restarted a dead reactor, and Danny Cruz, who never missed, and Lisa Grant, who transmitted until her last breath, and Sergeant Martinez, who held the line, and Dr. Price, who fought with a wrench, and every name on that list of 447 dead became a name that humanity remembered. Other species in the galaxy heard the story too, and they had thought humans were just another species and nothing special. And they were wrong, and the Velcron Dominion had seemed unstoppable, and they had conquered 17 species, and they had never lost a fleet, and now their invasion force was gone and destroyed by one damaged human ship. And the message was clear, and humanity would not kneel, and humanity would not surrender. And if you pushed them hard enough, they would push back harder. And every species that heard the story understood that humans were not prey. Morrison spent 2 days on New Haven after the evacuation, and he attended memorial services for his dead crew. And he spoke at each one, and he told their families that their sons and daughters and husbands and wives had saved 2 million people. And they had changed the course of history, and he meant every word. But the words felt empty because nothing he said could bring them back, and the families thanked him, and some of them hugged him, and some of them blamed him, and he accepted both, because he was the commander and the responsibility was his. Amy Walker recovered from her injuries and she was promoted to commander and given her own ship, and she turned down the promotion twice before accepting, because she said she did not deserve it, and Morrison told her she deserved it more than anyone, and she had been the tactical genius who made their victory possible, and she finally accepted. But she said she would never forget the Blackstar, and Morrison said none of them would. And that was true because you do not forget the day you should have died but did not. Danny Cruz was promoted to lieutenant commander and became a gunnery instructor, and he taught every new weapons officer in the fleet about the Battle of New Haven, and he showed them targeting solutions that seemed impossible, and he told them, nothing was impossible if you refused to believe it was. And his students worshipped him because he had killed 21 enemy ships and never missed a shot that mattered, and he was living proof that skill and determination could overcome any advantage. Paul Henderson retired from active service and became the chief designer for the next generation of human warships, and every ship he designed had a reactor based on the one he built for the Blackstar, and he made them more powerful and more reliable, and he added safety features that could be overridden in emergency situations, because sometimes you needed to push past safe limits, and his designs became the standard for the fleet, and humanity's ships became the most powerful in known space. And other species saw them and knew that humans had learned from the Blackstar. The Blackstar itself was too damaged to repair, and they towed it back to Earth orbit. And it took 6 months to make the journey, and when it arrived, millions of people came to see it, and the ship that had won the impossible battle, and they made it into a memorial and a museum, and people walked through its corridors and saw the plasma burns on the walls, and the places where crew members had made their last stands, and they left flowers and notes, and they cried for people they had never met but whose sacrifice they understood. Morrison received the Medal of Valor in a ceremony attended by representatives from every human colony and leaders from dozens of allied species. And he stood on a stage wearing his dress uniform, and the medal felt heavy around his neck, and when they asked him to speak, he said the medal belonged to his crew and especially to the 447 who did not come home, and he listed their names, and it took 20 minutes, and nobody moved or spoke until he was finished, and when he was done, the crowd stood and the silence was absolute, and Morrison looked out at them and saw tears on faces, and he knew the dead would be remembered. The Velcron Dominion did not attack human space again, and they had learned what it cost to face humanity. And other species had learned too, and some of them became allies because they wanted humans on their side, and some became enemies, but they were careful enemies who did not push too hard, and the balance of power in the galaxy shifted, and humanity was no longer the new species that could be ignored or conquered, and they were the species that destroyed the Velcron fleet, and that meant something to everyone. Morrison stayed in the service for another 10 years, and he commanded other ships and fought other battles, and he trained new officers and taught them about tactics and leadership and sacrifice, and he never had another crew like the one on the Blackstar, and he never expected to because what they did was unique and could never be repeated. And when he finally retired, he bought a small house on New Haven, and he lived there quietly, and sometimes people recognized him and thanked him, and he always said the same thing, and he said he was just doing his job. And the real heroes were the ones who did not come home. On the anniversary of the battle every year, Morrison went to the memorial on New Haven where 447 names were carved in stone, and he stood there for hours reading each name and remembering faces and voices, and the way they fought and the way they died. And he brought flowers, and he said he was sorry for the ones he could not save, and he said thank you for the ones who saved him. And every year more people came to stand with him until thousands filled the memorial ground, and they stood in silence honoring the crew that refused to surrender, and the ship that changed everything. The years passed, and the story of the USS Blackstar became more than just history, and it became mythology, and children grew up hearing about Commander Jake Morrison and his crew, and they played games pretending to be heroes who fought impossible battles and won. And the battle was studied in every military academy in human space, and officers analyzed the tactics and the decisions and the moments that made the difference between victory and death. And everyone agreed that what happened that day should have been impossible, but it happened anyway because the crew refused to accept defeat. The Velcron Dominion fell apart in the decade following the battle, and they had built their empire on fear and the appearance of invincibility. And when one human ship destroyed their fleet, that appearance shattered, and the species they had conquered rose up and fought back, and the Dominion collapsed from within, and their homeworld was blockaded by a coalition that included human ships, and the Velkron, who had once believed they would rule the galaxy, became a minor species that kept to themselves and avoided trouble, and they never spoke of the Battle of New Haven, but everyone knew they remembered. Other species looked at humanity differently now, and before the battle humans were seen as aggressive but not particularly dangerous, and they had decent technology, and they fought well, but they were just another species trying to survive in a hostile galaxy. And after the battle everything changed, and humans became known as the species that would not surrender, and the species that fought harder when pushed into a corner, and the species that turned one ship into a fleet killer through pure determination, and that reputation made some species want to be friends and others want to stay far away. And both reactions served humanity well. The human fleet grew larger and more powerful in the years after New Haven, and they built new ships using the technology that Paul Henderson developed, and they trained new crews using the tactics that Amy Walker invented, and they armed their ships with improved versions of the weapons that Danny Cruz used to kill 21 enemy vessels. And every ship in the fleet carried a memorial plaque that listed the names of the Blackstar crew, and the plaque was placed in the main corridor, where every crew member would see it every day and remember what sacrifice looked like. Morrison's house on New Haven became a place of pilgrimage, and people came from across human space to see where he lived, and to talk to the man who commanded the Blackstar. And Morrison was uncomfortable with the attention, but he understood why. People needed it, and they needed to believe that ordinary people could do extraordinary things, and they needed heroes who were real and human and flawed, and he was all of those things. And so he welcomed visitors and told them stories about his crew, and he made sure every story ended with the same message, and the message was that he was not special, but his crew was. And they were the real heroes. Amy Walker commanded 3 different ships over her career, and she fought in 7 major battles and won them all, and she never lost a ship. And officers who served under her said she had an instinct for tactics that seemed almost supernatural, and she could see patterns in chaos and find weaknesses in formations that no one else noticed. And she always said she learned everything from the Battle of New Haven and the desperate hours when every decision meant life or death, and that experience made her better than any training ever could. And when she finally retired, she wrote a book about modern naval tactics, and it became required reading at every academy. Danny Cruz taught weapons officers for 15 years, and then he took command of a destroyer. And he fought against pirates and raiders who thought they could prey on human shipping, and they were wrong. And Cruz hunted them with the same precision. He used against the Velkron, and he became known as someone you did not want to face in combat. And pirates started avoiding systems where his ship was stationed, and eventually he cleared an entire sector of hostile activity without firing a shot, because his reputation alone was enough to make criminals run. And when reporters asked him about it, he said he learned from the best crew in the galaxy, and they taught him that determination mattered more than firepower. Paul Henderson's reactor designs powered the new generation of human warships, and they were more efficient and more powerful than anything other species had, and human ships could outrun most enemies and outfight the rest. And Henderson also designed new weapon systems and shield generators and jump drives, and everything he created was built on the principle that ships needed to be able to push past their limits when necessary, because sometimes survival meant breaking the rules. And his motto became famous across the engineering corps. And the motto was that safe limits were for peacetime and war required everything you had and more. The memorial on New Haven grew over the years, and families of the dead crew members added personal touches, and there were pictures and letters and medals and children's drawings and flowers that were replaced weekly, and the names carved in stone were touched so often by visitors that they started to wear smooth. And the memorial became a sacred place where people came to remember and to reflect on the cost of freedom and the price of victory. And Morrison came every year without fail, and he stood there for hours, and sometimes people joined him and stood in silence, and sometimes he was alone. And both were fine, because the important thing was remembering. New threats emerged in the galaxy, and there were always species that wanted to expand their territory or test their strength against others, and some of them looked at humanity and remembered the Blackstar and decided to try diplomacy instead of war, and others decided to test whether the reputation was deserved, and those species learned quickly that humanity had not become soft. And the fleet that Morrison and his crew inspired was as determined and skilled as the original Blackstar. Crew and battles were fought and won, and the legend grew. 20 years after the Battle of New Haven, a young officer named Jake Morrison Jr. graduated from the academy, and he was the son of the famous commander. And he grew up with the weight of that name and the expectations that came with it, and people wondered if he could live up to his father's legacy, and the young Morrison said he was not trying to live up to anything, and he was just trying to serve with honor, like his father taught him. And he was assigned to a destroyer as a tactical officer, and he proved to be skilled and dedicated, and his commanding officer said he had his father's instinct for tactics and his mother's steady hands, and that was high praise. Morrison watched his son's career with pride and worry because he knew what combat cost, and he had seen too many good people die, and he wanted his son to be safe, but he also knew that serving was important and protecting others was worth the risk, and he told his son the same thing he told his crew 20 years ago. And he said that some things were worth fighting for, and you had to decide what those things were, and then you had to be willing to pay the price. And his son listened and understood, and Morrison knew he had raised him right. The Blackstar Memorial in Earth orbit received millions of visitors every year, and they walked through the ship seeing the battle damage and the places where crew members fought and died, and they left messages in a digital guest book, and the messages said things like, "Thank you, and we remember, and you saved us all," and the ship itself was maintained perfectly, and engineers made sure every system was preserved exactly as it was after the battle, and the plasma burns on the walls and the blast marks on the deck were cleaned but never repaired because they were part of the story, and the story needed to be told honestly. Morrison was invited to speak at the Academy graduation ceremony 30 years after the battle, and he was 72 years old, and his hair was white and his hands shook slightly, but his voice was still strong, and he stood in front of 500 new officers, and he told them about the day his crew chose to fight, and he told them about the people who did not come home, and he told them that being an officer meant making impossible choices and living with the consequences. And he said the most important thing was caring about the people under your command, because they would follow you anywhere if they knew you cared, and they would do impossible things if you believed they could. The new officers listened in complete silence, and when Morrison finished speaking, they stood and applauded for 10 minutes, and he stood there uncomfortable with the attention, but accepting it, because it was not really for him, and it was for his crew and all the people who had served and sacrificed. And when the applause finally ended, he saluted the new officers, and they saluted back, and Morrison felt old and tired, but also hopeful because these young people would carry the legacy forward, and they would protect humanity, and maybe some of them would face their own impossible battle, and maybe they would remember the Blackstar and find strength in that memory. 40 years after the battle, Morrison died quietly in his sleep at his home on New Haven, and he was 82 years old, and he had lived a long life. But everyone agreed it was not long enough, and the funeral was attended by thousands of people, including officers and politicians and representatives from allied species and common citizens, who never met him but felt like they knew him because his story was part of their story. And they buried him at the memorial next to the names of his crew, and the headstone was simple, and it said, "Commander."